Sometimes the truth doesn't need a lawyer to be heard. Sometimes it only needs courage. And on that day, in a courtroom heavy with judgment and expectation, one young girl, Aria Thompson, stood alone before the judge, and in a moment no one saw coming, she changed everything. The courtroom was full, packed with people who didn't come to watch justice unfold. No, most of them had already decided how this story would end before she ever walked through those heavy oak doors. Some sat there watching with idle curiosity, some with thinly veiled amusement. Others whispered to each other like they were waiting for the next act of a play they'd seen a dozen times before. But none of them, none, expected Arya to win, and she knew it. She stood there anyway. 16 years old, 5 feet tall if she stood up straight, and all she had was her voice out on the outside. Arya looked composed. Shoulders squared, chin up. She made sure her hands didn't shake when she placed them on the defense table in front of her. But inside, her heart was pounding so hard she swore the people sitting in the front row could hear it. The cuffs had come off her wrists just before they brought her in, but she could still feel them, like cold shadows clinging to her skin, like a reminder of where they believed she belonged. They'd stripped her dignity away long before this day, long before this trial. And yet, somehow, here she was, still standing, still fighting. The judge, Malcolm Pritchard, watched her like a cat watches a mouse, equal parts bored and amused. He was an older man, his black robe hanging loose on his narrow frame. His fingers tapped out a slow rhythm on the bench. To him, this wasn't a trial. It was theater, and he'd seen this play before. He knew how it ended. He was sure of it. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice smooth, oozing condescension. "You're representing yourself." Arya nodded once. "That's right." The judge chuckled quietly, shaking his head like he pitied her. "Bold," he mused. "Foolish, but bold." He leaned forward a little, squinting at her as though trying to understand what kind of creature she was. "You do understand the seriousness of this case, Miss Thompson? You understand the consequences if you're found guilty." "I understand," Arya replied. "I also understand that I didn't do what they're accusing me of." A ripple ran through the gallery. Not loud, more like a current of disbelief passing from person to person. She wasn't supposed to say that. She wasn't supposed to look so calm. Girls like her were supposed to keep their heads down, eyes lowered. They were supposed to take the deal, plead guilty, move on, not fight. The prosecutor, Simon Baxter, cleared his throat, his eyes cool and impersonal. "Your Honor, the state recommends we proceed. We believe the evidence." Judge Pritchard silenced him with a lazy wave of his hand. He wasn't done toying with her yet. He turned his gaze back to Arya. "Tell me," he said, "how exactly do you plan to defend yourself? You've never studied law. You have no experience. You can't even afford a lawyer." He let those last words hang in the air. The blow was intentional, and it hit its mark. Laughter trickled through the courtroom. Soft at first, then spreading. Cruel. Mocking. Arya's fingers curled tightly around the edge of the table. She said nothing at first, letting them have their moment. Letting them believe she was a punchline in their ugly little joke. "You can't afford justice," Pritchard said with a smirk. More laughter, but Arya didn't flinch. Not once. She took a breath and let it out slow. When the noise finally died down, she lifted her chin, met the judge's gaze, and spoke. "I might not be able to afford a lawyer," she said, "but I can afford the truth." Silence. This time, when it spread through the courtroom, it didn't feel like laughter waiting to happen. It felt heavier, real. It pressed on everyone like a weight they weren't ready to carry. The judge's fingers stopped tapping. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, and Arya kept talking. "You can laugh," she said, her voice clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "You can mock me. You can act like I don't belong here. But none of that changes the truth." She turned to the jury. 12 strangers. 12 people who would decide whether she walked out of this room or didn't. Some met her gaze. Some didn't. "The only reason I'm here," Arya said, "is because nobody bothered to ask the right questions." They were listening now. She could feel it. Arya had grown up knowing life wasn't fair. She was used to watching people like her get blamed for things they didn't do. She'd seen enough to understand that fairness wasn't something you waited for. It was something you fought for. She was 16 years old. And in those 16 years, she'd learned that opportunity was scarce where she lived. But struggle? Struggle was everywhere. The night of the party ran through her mind like a movie stuck on repeat. She'd almost skipped it. School had been brutal that week, and her mother needed her home to help with her little brother. But her best friend, Kiera, had begged her to go, just for a few hours. A chance to breathe. The party wasn't wild. Not at first. Music loud enough to vibrate the floor, a crowd big enough to feel like something was happening, but not so big that it got out of control. Arya was careful, always careful. She didn't drink. She didn't smoke. She knew how fast things could turn bad, and they did. Cops showed up like they knew exactly where to look and who to look for. People scattered. Some ran. Some didn't. Arya didn't run. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had nothing to hide. Except when they searched her backpack, there was a bag of pills inside. She hadn't seen it before. It wasn't hers. But the cop holding it up in front of her didn't care. His eyes didn't flicker. His face didn't change. He didn't ask her anything. Didn't listen when she tried to explain. She was just another black girl caught at a party. And that was enough. Now here she was. Arya stood straighter, even though the weight on her chest was crushing. She knew the odds were stacked against her. The public defender assigned to her case told her as much. Take the deal, he'd said. If you fight it, you'll lose. If you lose, it's 5 years. Maybe more. But she hadn't done it. She wouldn't plead guilty. Not for something she didn't do. And now she stood alone. No lawyer. No fancy suit. No money. Just her truth. The drugs weren't mine, she said. I didn't even know they were there. But none of you cared to ask. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. The prosecutor glanced at his watch. But Arya didn't stop. You want to talk about what I can't afford? She asked. Let's talk about that. She took a step toward the jury box. I couldn't afford to run when the cops showed up because I knew running would make me guilty in their eyes. I couldn't afford to cry when they found something in my bag that wasn't mine because I knew nobody would believe me. And I couldn't afford a lawyer because justice costs money. Money I don't have. She let the words hang there for a moment. But I can't afford the truth, she said, softer now. And I'm standing here telling it. Arya laid it out piece by piece. They hadn't found her fingerprints on the bag. No DNA. No witnesses said they saw her with it. Nothing connected her to it except proximity. I was at a party, she said. That's all. I was standing in the room. The prosecutor tried to interrupt. She didn't let him. They assumed it was mine, she said. Because I was there. Because I don't have a lawyer. Because I'm a black girl from the wrong side of town. And people like me, we don't get the benefit of the doubt. The judge no longer looked amused. His hands tightened around the gavel. The jury shifted in their seats. The prosecutor's notes suddenly seemed less useful. The officer who arrested me didn't ask anybody if they saw me with those drugs, Arya said. He didn't check if they belonged to somebody else. He didn't care. Because to him, I was guilty the second he looked at me. She took a breath. Her voice softened. The law says innocent until proven guilty, she said. But that's not true, is it? Not for everybody. The room was quiet. It wasn't mockery anymore. It was reckoning. When Judge Pritchard finally spoke, his voice had changed. This court will take a recess. He looked at her. Really looked at her. She had done what they said was impossible. She had made them listen. The court reconvened after an hour that felt like forever. Arya stood at the defense table. She wasn't shaking anymore. The judge cleared his throat. His voice was steady, but different now. The court finds insufficient evidence to support the charges against Miss Thompson. The words hung there. Heavy. Final. All charges are dismissed. No cheers. No applause. Just silence. But it was a different silence than before. Arya stood there for a moment. Then she stepped back, her head high, her shoulders straight. Not because she won, though she had, but because she had forced them to see her, to hear her. When she left the courtroom, she didn't rush. She didn't flee. She walked. The prosecutor avoided her eyes. The jury sat still, processing. Even Judge Pritchard stayed quiet, his gaze lingering on her just a second longer than he needed to. He didn't apologize. He didn't have to. She'd already taken back what they tried to steal, her voice, her truth. Aria Thompson walked into that courtroom a defendant. She walked out something else. She didn't change the system that day, but she cracked it. She forced it to look at itself. And sometimes, that's where change begins.